Okay, so right now I will be explaining a brief history of Osgood and Schramm's circular model of communication. So it was made on 1954. According to them, it was an attempt to rectify the earlier linear models of communication. It can happen within ourselves, which is called intrapersonal communication, and it can happen also between two people, which is called interpersonal communication. According to Wilbur Schramm, he stated in 1954 that it is misleading to think of the communications process as starting somewhere and ending somewhere. It is really endless, so maybe this is why they made this model of communication based on what they have think about or thought about, that communication is really endless. So that's all.
The components of the Osgood-Schramm communication model. The first component is the sender. This is the person who encodes and sends the message. The second component is the message. This is the content that being shared between the parties. The third component is the receiver. This is the person who decodes the message. The fourth component is the semantic barriers. The backgrounds, beliefs, experiences, and values that influence how the sender conveys a message and how the receiver interprets it.
Component of model. We have message, encoder, decoder, and interpreter. First of all, we have a message, which one person is trying to communicate. Second is encoder. It's a person who sends the message or where the message originates from. Third is decoder, the person who received the message. And lastly, we have the interpreter. The interpreter, the one who tries to analyze or understand the message.
Now, I will introduce to you the process of Schramm and Osgood's model of communication. First, the Schramm and Osgood's model of communication is a communication that is circular in nature. This model of communication includes the encoder, the decoder, and the interpreter. The encoder sends the message that the decoder receives, and the interpreter is the person who analyzes or interprets the message and go back to the encoder. The cycle goes on and on.
Let's talk about the advantages or strength and disadvantages or weaknesses in the Osgood-Schramm model. First is the advantages or strength. It shows how feedback can work. In this model, it works well for explaining cyclical feedback. Other models see communication as being a one-way street, which fail to account for feedback and dialogue. In this model, the speaker can get feedback about their language, joke, choice of words, and etc. So they can try to communicate more and more clearly as the cycle continues. Next is recognizes that communication is complex. By accounting for encoding, decoding, and interpretation, this model shows how sometimes we can mishear and misinterpret information. Next is sees us as active communicators. While other models see people receiving information as passive recipients, this one shows how we are active in interacting or interpreting information we receive. Let's go to disadvantages or weaknesses in the Osgood-Schramm model. First is it doesn't recognize that communication can be unequal. There is many circumstances where communication may involve one authority figure talking and one or many listeners trying to interpret the message. In such instances, communication is much less equal than in Schramm's model. Therefore, this model doesn't tend to work in situations where power balances exist. In fact, this model does a poor job overall of understanding how power functions in communication. Second is, it doesn't work for mass communication. This is another time communication is unequal. One person communicating to many looks very different to the circular one-to-one model proposed in the Osgood Schramm approach. For more appropriate approach for mass media, try the Wesley-McLean model or Laswell's model of communication. So this Osgood Schramm model is not it doesn't work on many listeners because maybe the listeners may interpret the message or misunderstood the message. So this is not a proper or correct model for the mass media. So let's try the Wesley-McLean model or Laswell's model to communicate to more listeners or to mass media. That's all.
The Osgood Schramm model is based on the theory that communication is a two-way path. It also implies that communication is circular rather than linear with a sender and receiver. It is a type of communication that allows both participants into listening and reacting type of conversation. For example, you talk to your friend through phone, and you tell her something about your experience today, and she listens, then she reacts. That is an example of Osgood Schramm model.
In the past video clips in this video, you learned all about the Osgood and Schramm model. So now I will be talking about the uniqueness of Schramm and Osgood models, because it can happen with ourselves or two people. Each person acts as both sender and receiver and use to interpret one another. And it is simultaneously take place. Example, when you're encoding, interpret, and decoding. So it can be used to determine how communication between two people works when they're exchanging information, ideas, and attitudes. That's all.
Let you go. Baby, now it's best here to lay me down and rest here. Let's dream of corduroy. Work for what you love to do, and I will watch right over you. With your heart I'll never toy.